Hello everyone, and welcome back to Scary Interesting. In this video, we're going to go over 3 extremely strange and disturbing things happening deep in the water, or at least sorta. You'll see what I mean, and as always, viewer discretion is advised. It was late afternoon on March 9th, 1997 in Napa County, California, as locals and tourists started to gather along the shores of Lake Berryessa. They weren't there to fish or swim though. Instead, they were drawn there by a unique attraction, the Morning Glory Spillway. When the lake level is low enough, the spillway looks like something right out of a video game. It's a huge concrete tube that looks like it could transport you to a different plane of existence. When the water is high, however, it looks like something else entirely. To some, it's like an optical illusion dropped into the middle of a reservoir. To others, it looks like Lake Berryessa has a built-in drain. In reality, the spillway is actually an essential part of California's water infrastructure. It just also happens to be one of the most hypnotic and terrifying man-made features in the entire state, which is why people tend to gather to see it in action. The spillway sits roughly 200 yards from the Monticello Dam, which is a 304-foot tall concrete arch built between 1953 and 1957 to create the Lake Berryessa Reservoir. When it rains too much or the nearby mountain snowpack melts too fast, all the water has to go somewhere, and that's where the spillway comes in. At the surface of the lake, the spillway is 72 feet or 22 meters in diameter. This is big enough to comfortably fit a semi-truck on its side. It then plunges straight down over 200 feet or 61 meters before narrowing to a 28-foot or 9-meter wide pipe at the bottom. And then from there, the water shot downstream with incredible force. The spillway also isn't operated with a button or switch from the dam. It does its job automatically. Once the lake reaches its maximum level of 440 feet above sea level, the spillway activates, and when it does, it can drain at a terrifying rate of 48,000 cubic feet per second. This is enough to fill an Olympic-sized swimming pool in less than 2 seconds. And when the lake is full, the surface of the water glides over the edge of the spillway and vanishes in a smooth, swirling cascade. There's no chaos on top, just an eerie surface current that pulls toward the dark opening. Now, the spillway wasn't designed for beauty, but has become a spectacle anyway. When it's active, people will travel from all over just to witness it. It's been featured in viral videos, drone footage, and horror-tinged documentaries. There's just something mesmerizing about it, how such a clean, geometric form can hold so much raw power beneath the surface. And although it was originally built as a safety measure, it's become a chilling reminder of the balance between utility and danger. It's also a marvel of physics, gravity, and hydrodynamic design, but it's also a structure that seems to tap into the part of the human brain that feels compelled to look over the edge just a little too long. By the time anyone saw 41-year-old Emily near the spillway, it was already too late. The following day on March 10th, the Napa Valley Register was the first to report on the incident. The article describes how witnesses claim to have seen a fully clothed woman suddenly get into the lake and start swimming toward the spillway. As she got closer and closer, spectators on shore began to realize the danger and started yelling at her to get away and swim another direction. But whether she couldn't hear their pleas or just didn't care to listen, she didn't alter her course. When she reached the concrete spillway opening, she reportedly climbed onto the lip and stood there for a moment weeping. Then she was gone. No flailing, no screaming, just a silent decision and a final deliberate step forward. But it seems that this version is not actually correct. The next day, the Record Searchlight published a report from the Associated Press that apparently corrected several key details and painted a much more horrifying story. The lake level was known to be high that evening and the spillway was active, which is what drew spectators to gather there to witness it. As they watched millions of gallons of water draining from the lake through the spillway, they noticed a fully clothed woman enter the water and begin to swim toward the drain. The water was apparently glassy and no one realized just how close she was drifting to the spillway until it was almost too late. Because so much water is being drawn into the spillway that the surface of the lake was under the influence of a massive hydraulic pull, one that grew stronger the closer you got to the edge. So by the time bystanders realized what was happening, Emily was already in trouble. People shouted, desperate to get her attention, but again, whether she didn't hear them or couldn't fight the current, she continued drifting closer and closer. And finally, she was caught in it, completely at the mercy of the water. Witnesses would later say she reached the lip of the glory hole and somehow managed to grab hold of the edge. For 15, maybe 20 minutes, Emily reportedly clung there. There was no way to reach her and no safe way to help her. The spillway's brutally efficient design made rescue impossible. It wasn't just something that could be turned off, so when she could hold on no longer, Emily was gone, just like that. Another day later, the San Francisco Gate chimed in with an account that was absent any speculation about whether Emily's death was a deliberate act. Instead, it was described as a freak accident, no more and no less. In the end, 3 articles told very different stories of what must have been a harrowing few moments on Lake Berryessa, and from those fractured pieces, the internet began to build its own narrative. Online forums, YouTube videos, blogs, and Reddit posts alike have tried to retell the story of a woman who died at the spillway. Many of these cite the gripping image of her struggling to hang on while onlookers screamed from the shore. Some claim she was drawn in as if by supernatural force. Others circle back to the theory that she chose this path and that the spillway represented some kind of symbolic final destination. Whatever the case, Emily's death has since become legend, not just because it was tragic, but because it happened where it did. The spillway is almost mythological in its appearance, like a portal to another world. It swallows water, light, and noise, and in 1997 it swallowed Emily. Thankfully, in all of its decades of existence, Emily's is the only known death at the Morning Glory spillway. For all the countless ships lost at sea, few have inspired as much intrigue and speculation as the one known as the Surcouf. It was designed in an era of bold naval experimentation meant to be the future of submarine warfare. But although it promised to revolutionize naval combat, from the moment it was launched, the submarine struggled with mechanical failures and operational shortcomings, each problem compounding on the next as France descended into the chaos during World War II. So despite its planned potential, it spent more time docked than at sea, and after the war started, it remained in service as an oddity rather than an effective weapon. Then, in June 1940, France fell to Germany and its navy found itself in a perilous position. Many ships, including the Surcouf, were caught between the Allies and the newly established government in France, which now collaborated with Germany. Then, with German forces closing in, the sub's commander ordered the Surcouf to set sail for the British port of Plymouth. 5 days later, the massive submarine arrived, but simultaneously as the situation in France deteriorated, Winston Churchill, concerned that French ships might fall into German hands, ordered British forces to seize all French warships in British ports. British sailors then stormed the Surcouf, the submarine was taken by force, and its remaining crew were given an ultimatum. They could either swear allegiance to the Free French forces or be sent home. Most of them would end up choosing to be sent home, and by the time the dust settled, the Surcouf was left with only 16 of its original crew. British naval leaders also quickly saw the Surcouf as more of a burden than an asset. The sub's unique design made it a poor fit for traditional submarine operations, and its reliability issues made it unsuitable for aggressive combat. The Free French forces, however, saw things differently. In their eyes, the submarine was more than just a warship, it was a symbol of French resistance. They insisted the submarine remain active despite the British Admiralty's reservations. What then followed was a series of misadventures that cemented the Surcouf's reputation as an unreliable and even dangerous vessel. In November of 1940, it was sent to Scotland for training, but with an inexperienced crew and a complex design, the process was slow. Then after arriving there, after less than 2 weeks of exercises, the Surcouf was deemed seaworthy and sent to the Western Atlantic for convoy escort duty, and already its first assignment was a complete failure. Mechanical issues caused it to arrive in Halifax 6 days late, and the ship required nearly a month of repairs before it could continue service. Then when the Surcouf finally joined the convoy in April of 1941, it was more of a liability than a protector. It could neither dive quickly enough to evade air attacks, nor fire its torpedoes while submerged. The troubles then continued when the Surcouf was sent to Bermuda in June of 1941 for its first war patrol. What should have been a routine mission turned into an operational disaster. Electrical failures shut down critical systems, a fire broke out in the switchgear room, and a botched dive resulted in flooding that released chlorine gas into the submarine's interior. The patrol was then abandoned and the Surcouf limped back to Bermuda in disgrace. It was abundantly clear that the ship was not fit for combat. So already by late 1941, its reputation had deteriorated to the point that even minor incidents fed growing suspicions. During one patrol, for example, the Surcouf encountered a Norwegian tanker, but its crew failed to properly identify themselves. The tanker, fearing it was about to be attacked, then sent out a distress call claiming it was under threat from a large submarine flying the French flag. The situation was later explained as a miscommunication, but the damage had already been done. Rumors then spread that the Surcouf had gone rogue and was secretly supplying German U-boats, or that its crew was plotting to defect. By early 1942, British patience had run out, but the Free French forces, however, refused to decommission the ship, so a new solution was found. On February 12, 1942, the Surcouf left Bermuda under orders to sail for the Panama Canal. Its ultimate destination was the French-held island of Tahiti, where it would serve as a defensive asset. The Pacific was a logical place to send the ship, far from the tensions of the Atlantic, where its presence had done more harm than good. So officially, the ship was meant to help defend French Polynesia, but to many in command, this was a convenient way to remove it from active duty without an outright decommissioning. The journey afterward was expected to take only a few days. The Surcouf would pass through the Panama Canal, refuel at Cologne, and then continue on to the Pacific. But it never arrived. No distress signal was received and no wreckage was recovered. The submarine and its crew of 130 men simply vanished. For a long time afterward, no one really knew what happened until the official explanation finally came nearly 3 years later. Apparently, the Surcouf had been lost in a collision with an American freighter called the Thompson Lakes on the night of February 18th or the early morning of the 19th. This apparently occurred roughly 70 nautical miles north of Cristobal, Panama. According to the freighter's report, it was a dark night when it was steaming alone from Guantanamo Bay and it struck what appeared to be a partially submerged object. The impact was then followed by a loud explosion and a flash of fire on both sides of the freighter's bow. One report even claims that crew members reported hearing voices crying out in English from the water, but fearing that they had struck a German U-boat, the ship didn't stop. Instead, they radioed the incident to naval authorities and continued on their route. When the report was later examined, it was assumed that the unknown vessel had been the Surcouf, and afterward the submarine was declared lost with all hands. Even at the time, however, doubts lingered. The first question was one of timing. The Thompson Lakes report was filed immediately, but the loss of the Surcouf wasn't announced until April 18, 1942, 2 months after the fact. The collision theory itself was also not made public until January of 1945, almost 3 years after the submarine's disappearance. If the matter had been as straightforward as a simple naval accident, why the delay? Why did neither the US nor British authorities seem eager to confirm the details of the Surcouf's loss? Then there was also the troubling matter of the voices claimed to be heard after the collision. The Surcouf's crew were almost entirely French-speaking, but supposedly the cries were in English. And so the loss of the submarine might have been accepted more widely had it not been for the strange circumstances surrounding the ship's disappearance. The lack of a confirmed wreck, the delays in reporting its fate, and the conflicting accounts of its final moments fueled speculation that whatever its end was hadn't been an accident. And over time, alternative theories emerged, ranging from plausible explanations of friendly fire to wild conspiracy claims of sabotage, secret missions, and even treachery. One of the more credible alternative explanations came from US military records. On the morning of February 19, 1942, just hours after the Surcouf was supposedly struck by the Thompson Lakes, a US patrol bomber reported sinking a large submarine off the coast of Panama. There was no record of German or Japanese submarines in the area, leading some to speculate that the Surcouf had been mistaken for an enemy vessel and destroyed by friendly fire. And others have taken the mystery even further. Like, for example, for months before its disappearance, the Surcouf had been the subject of rumors both in the British and American navies. Suspicion about the loyalty of the crew had grown, and a particularly extreme version of this theory suggested that at least one of its officers was a German infiltrator, inserted into the Free French Navy during the hasty recruitment of a new crew. If true, then the Surcouf was not just an unreliable ship, it was a dangerous one. Some believed that British or American forces had arranged for it to be eliminated, either through sabotage or by deliberately targeting it at sea. So without a confirmed wreck, the precise fate of the Surcouf remains unknown. But even taking the official account as the correct one paints a horrifying end. If that's actually what happened, the submarine was impacted in the middle of a pitch-black night while on the surface. If there were explosions as reported, then the crew had been battling fires, noxious gases, and flooding until the power eventually shut off, at which point they would have also been almost completely blinded. Then if the ship began to sink, 130 men may have slowly succumbed to whatever horrific fate that must have been. And possibly worse, if some escaped, then they would have been left in the open ocean, possibly injured and over 50 miles from any land. And as no survivors have ever been found, for the 130 men, whatever the real case, it seems, no matter what it was, it must have been truly disturbing. By the time he turned 50 years old, Guy Garman had already lived the kind of life that could fill a best-selling memoir. Born to missionaries, many of his formative years were spent roaming the jungles of the Amazon rainforest in Peru with the native people. Growing up in this place where civilization thinned out and the world was raw shaped Guy in ways most could never understand. As a result, he became deeply curious, independent, and unafraid of venturing where others might hesitate. From the Amazon, Guy's journey took him to boarding schools across several South American countries before he would eventually enroll at Point Loma Nazarene University. He then studied osteopathic medicine and eventually specialized in the field of ear, nose, and throat medicine. For 13 years afterward, he built a reputable and modest private practice in Maryville, Tennessee. In 2010, Guy relocated to the US Virgin Islands with his family, settling in St. Croix and opening up a practice near the coast. It was here that he earned the moniker Dr. Deep. Shortly after arriving at 51 years old, his fascination with diving quickly bloomed. He began training with the St. Croix Blue Water Adventurers, and it didn't take long before Guy eclipsed the abilities of those teaching him. Most of his instructors hit their depth limit at around 215 feet or 66 meters, but Guy was much more ambitious. On the surface, he was just a physician with a thriving practice and a family he adored, but below that calm, everyday exterior, something else was taking shape. It was a sort of gnawing need to test the limits of what the human body could do underwater, and after just 2 years of diving experience, Guy decided that he was just the man to shatter the world record for the deepest recreational scuba dive. Now, just hearing that, you might immediately view Guy as reckless. And many did once he started spreading the word about his plans, but friends and colleagues would describe him as meticulous and even scientific in his preparation. For 2 additional years, he threw himself into the planning of the record-breaking dive attempt like it was a second career. He obsessed over every detail, calculation, tank, and even breath. He spoke to other deep divers, analyzed their failures and successes, and tried to design a dive that left no room for error. Because the mark Guy was about to beat was set in September of 2014 by Ahmed Gabber, who descended to 1,090 feet or 332 meters in the Red Sea. That dive required military-like precision, years of technical experience, and a support team of professionals who had trained extensively. Even if any other diver could duplicate all that, Ahmed's feat was viewed as nearly untouchable in the diving world. This obviously didn't deter Guy, his plans, or his goal though. He set a dive date of August 15th, 2015 and a target depth of 1,200 feet or 366 meters. This is almost the entire height of the Empire State Building. The dive plan itself was almost overwhelming in its complexity. A dive site located at Long Reach was then chosen, and there, Guy himself fixed a 1,300-foot or 396-meter line anchored by a 250-pound weight at the bottom. This rope would serve as his lifeline, his guide, and his proof of besting Ahmed's record. If he reached the 1,200-foot mark and clipped a marker onto the line, that act alone would satisfy the world record officials reviewing the attempt. Supporting the attempt as well would be 3 boats that would carry 28 team members. Then, throughout the water column, nearly 30 tanks were staged in addition to the 7 that would be strapped to Guy's body. To begin the dive, 2 divers would accompany him down to the 200-foot or 61-meter mark before Guy would begin a solo descent the rest of the way. Then, once at his target depth, he would clip the marker to the line and begin a rapid ascent to the 350-foot or 107-meter mark. At this point, there would be an air station and more support divers who would be waiting. From the time he began his solo descent to the point where he'd be arriving at the air station was estimated to take about 38 minutes. Then after that, the rest of the dive would unfold over nearly 10 more grueling hours as Guy slowly made his way up to the 350-foot mark, stopping every 10 feet or 3 meters to allow his body to safely decompress. At each level, there would be support divers there helping him to swap tanks, provide hot soup, and monitor his vitals. Finally, when everything had been carefully planned and accounted for, on August 15th, all that was left for Guy and his team was to execute. After suiting up and laying around his equipment, Guy entered the water with his 20-year-old son and another support diver, both of whom would accompany Guy down to 200 feet. When they were ready, Guy gave the signal and the 3 disappeared into the crystal blue Caribbean waters. The first stage of the plan called for the support divers to essentially carry Guy down to 200 feet so he could conserve his energy for what would be a grueling ascent. To conserve his specialized gas mixtures as well for the extreme depths below, he also breathed from his son's tanks. Then when they arrived at their first destination, Guy was tethered to the line and his support divers let go, commencing a rapid descent into the deep blue darkness below. When they arrived at their first destination, Guy was tethered to the line and his support divers let go, commencing a rapid descent into the deep blue darkness. Everything came down to what would happen during the next 38 minutes. The support divers looked down into the water with confidence that everything had been meticulously prepared, but also with a growing anxiety. 10 minutes passed, then 20, then 30, and as it drew closer to 38 minutes, a new set of support divers entered the water and descended to the air station at 350 feet. Then when it passed the 38-minute mark without any sign of Guy coming up the rope, the divers waited again with the same sense of anxious confidence. With so many moving parts and things that need to be just so, a potential delay in Guy's arrival time was planned for, but then after 20 minutes passed with still no movement on the line, all that changed. There were no bubbles returned to the surface either, a sure sign that Guy would have been ascending toward the 350-foot station. Either way, divers on standby at the station stayed submerged as long as they safely could with their eyes fixed on the line. Then when they had to surface, more divers went in to take their place. Back on the boats, Guy's wife and son waited, searching the water for any break in the stillness or any news from below that eyes had been laid on Guy, but there was nothing. Before long, search crews began sweeping the surrounding area by boat and sonar, but no one really expected to find him floating elsewhere since he was tethered to the drop line. If he was alive, he would have to come back up the rope, but Guy never did. Even with tanks staged along the dive line, just in case he was delayed and could still use them to surface safely, no movement came. And eventually, enough time passed that the team was left to reckon with his absence. By the next morning, word had spread that Guy was missing and presumed dead. For the many doubters and skeptics, this is exactly what they thought would happen. So what went so wrong and what happened to Guy? From the perspective of diving experts who saw the plan, the biggest issue was Guy's inexperience and what many saw as overconfidence in the face of it. Again, Guy had only been diving for 2 years when he decided he was going to break the world depth record in 2 additional years. Even by the time the world record came around, Guy had logged fewer than 600 total dives. Of those, only 1/3 were in excess of 200 feet, and in all, the number of dives Guy performed to 500 feet or further stood at just 35. To his credit though, he did perform a successful practice dive in April 2015 to a depth of 815 feet or 248 meters. This is a mark only a handful of divers had reached at that point, but to many in the community, it simply wasn't enough. The record he intended to break was a full 1/3 deeper. And there were other aspects of the dive plan that were criticized too. For his descent, Guy was wearing 7 air tanks, 3 of which were what are termed as monster tanks due to their size and weight. With all his gear on, it was estimated that Guy was carrying around 400 pounds of excess weight, which would have certainly helped him descend quickly, but likely would have been problematic for his ascent. And in fact, even when enough time had passed that ensured Guy was dead, none of the 3 boats had the equipment strong enough to haul up the weighted line Guy was attached to. Other critics pointed out that the plan to have support divers waiting for him at 350 feet was short-sighted, and that he should have had support at much deeper depths since that's where the biggest threat was. So, what exactly happened to Guy is not entirely clear. His body was eventually retrieved from the water on August 18th, 3 days after his failed dive. To put in perspective how difficult this feat is, even as of this recording, Ahmed Gaber's 2014 depth record of 1,090 feet still stands. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching. If you have a story suggestion, feel free to submit it to the forum found in the description. Also, if you want to support the channel, consider joining the Patreon or becoming a channel member here on YouTube. Anyways, thanks again, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.